Hi there, y'all. Welcome back to the Queer Armor. So, when it comes to outdoor survivalness stuff, there is a rule commonly known and passed around. It's definitely true, called the rule of threes. Relatively simple. You can survive for 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without oxygen. Now, the 3 minutes without oxygen is the one that freaks most people out. Thinking about it, it might make sense, but it doesn't make it less scary. Dying in minutes, that'll freak anybody out. But oxygen, realistically, is a thing that you can regulate pretty much automatically. Don't get me wrong, you absolutely need to keep breathing. I'm not sitting here saying like, fuck that air stuff, who needs air? But short an environmental disaster, or physically being in a space where oxygen is limited, air is a thing that, in an emergency, that's, as long as you're breathing, that shouldn't be your focus. Air, realistically, you should think about some filtration systems, but the amount of preparation and forethought put into your breathing is probably less than some of the other areas that you're going to need to prepare for. The 3 days without water, and water in and of itself is a complicated resource to understand how to utilize, so that's going to get probably its own video, if not several. And don't get me wrong, that's also an important topic. But I'd also say water's the kind of thing that the need itself is far more linear. You need clean water, and you can kind of use some simple math to figure out how much water you're going to need. And realistically, no matter what my autistic ass will tell you when we're in the field, you can just drink water. It doesn't need to be flavored. It doesn't need to be anything special. So the water complexity problem is significantly lower. Cleaning it is its own mystical science. Maintaining your water supply and tools to do so is its own problem. Again, it's its own video. But I started making this thinking I was going to be making a single video. I seriously thought when I started putting this together, oh hey, DIY MRE. That sounds like a cool idea. But in reality, the more that I dived into it, the more that I realized this is a topic that is so complex and has so many layers to it that you can't just do this as a one and done. In fact, I think I'm going to have to do this as like a big series to be able to really emphasize how important this is. Now, some of you might be asking, WTF is an MRE, and if you honestly don't know what that acronym is, welcome to Hiking and Survivalist Spaces, because unfortunately, every company has been using that acronym for a long time. MRE stands for Meals Ready to Eat. It is essentially storable, travelable, contained food thing, designed to be eaten originally by soldiers, but eventually used also as emergency supplies for basically every disaster, and as a source of humanitarian relief. MREs, however, are a relatively recent invention. In fact, the specific MRE actually comes from the 90s. That's kind of late in the development of military foodstuffs, which has been developed basically as long as we've had militaries. In the immortal words of Napoleon Bonaparte, who may or may not have actually said this, an army marches on its stomach. And regardless of whether or not he actually said it, he definitely believed it, because Napoleon's army was well fed. In fact, to the time, it was one of the most well-fed militaries, period. This is part of the reason why Napoleon was actually able to be as successful as he was, and part of the reason he was able to endear himself to his troops. He understood that his troops needed to live, needed to eat, needed to survive on more than just gruel, which at the time is mostly what soldiers were doing. Pre-World War I, the vast majority of military rations were basically camping rations. It was you went hunting. And this ended up being kind of a big problem, because you are talking about the rations that militaries need, the actual food stuff that you need to move, to physically advance on your foe, to be able to charge, to do the incredibly complex things that battle requires. If you can't feed your army, you don't have an army. And that's also part of the reason why a lot of early military battles have patterns that almost don't make sense nowadays. In fact, going back to the Crusades, there are even examples of people stopping twice in the middle of battle for meals, basically honoring the time-honored tradition of time out. Now, in the late 1800s, leading up to World War I, there started to be a lot of advances, kind of just generally. The whole world was doing better. Mechanization meant that suddenly you weren't necessarily limited to the food stuff, that your local butchers had access to. You could tin things. Shipping, long-distance commerce routes were just becoming more of a thing again now that we were fully automating and embracing the automobile and trains. And this ended up meaning that a lot of the food that soldiers had also advanced. Tinning led to, and canning led to a lot of military rations suddenly including cans. This is where also a lot of early real-world evidence of what happens when you leave food in cans for a long time started to come in. You don't know when you're going to need to move your army, you don't know where, and you don't know for how long. So often, you're going to just store your food supplies. You want to be able to move whenever. Well, that leads to a contradiction, because if you want to store your food supplies, but you need to have fresh food for soldiers, what do? And frequently at the time was, well, you can some stuff, and then you continue the time-honored tradition of hunting in the local area and pillaging from local communities in order to get food for your soldiers. Really endears your army to the locals. Prior to World War I, we did have one major development, something called hardtack. Now, hardtack's an interesting stuff. It's a bread of sorts. Calling it bread is honestly kind of an insult to most bread, because it is, how do I put this? It is teeth-shatteringly hard. Hardtack has the word hard in it for a reason. Now, on the one hand, it was so calorie dense that it was able to provide a not unreasonable amount of nutrition to soldiers. In addition to that, the fact that it was so hard is also the thing that prevented it from going bad. It was hard because it had this very solid, very dense crust, and then the material behind it was dense itself as well. To the point that, one, hardtack, if stored properly, borderline doesn't have a shelf life. Now that's if stored properly in cooled, dry places. But that also means that if you store it properly, you can have 25 years of rations relatively cheaply. And that was the end of the good things I'm going to say about hardtack. Because, oh my god, is that stuff terrible. Soldiers had to drink it by mixing it with tea. Because it was so freaking hard, it would genuinely break teeth open. Then, World War I breaks out. And darn, isn't everybody ready to go off to war and support their country, or the attack of someone else's country, or the defense of the attack in support of somebody who's supporting somebody else's country? World War I was kind of fucked, but regardless, everybody was going to war, and we suddenly had a lot of advancements that had been recently made in food. And yes, surprisingly, during World War I, food advancement for the troops didn't move all that much. Turns out a lot of the stuff that had come about was more aimed at middle-class folks. And a lot of the people who we were sending was not middle class. Why do they always send the poor? The one thing that did change, those kitchens started becoming field kitchens. You started having a lot of soldiers basically were moved around where the food source was. And they would just charge the food source forward. However, this ended up meaning that a lot of times soldiers would advance and then get surrounded and not be able to get resupplied. They knew this. So what both sides came up with were emergency rations. These were rations, frequently tinned, that would be given to the soldiers as an emergency. It wasn't to be used as their go-to foods or on a regular basis, but it was food that was stored, and in theory, they could eat. But as we've discussed, storing food long-term is very complicated, and some things survived well. There's some things that technically survived to this day. Other things, not so much. Some stuff barely made it out of the factories, let alone the years they would spend stored before being used. Unfortunately, plenty of soldiers lost their lives, not to bullets, but to scurvy and malnutrition. One thing that was fairly common in troop rations in World War I was stew making. Frequently, soldiers would share their rations together, take the bits of meat that were given, and combine them all into a larger stew that would then be divvied up. It's kind of funny thinking about the US military taking a slightly communist approach to soldiers feeding themselves, but here we are. World War II came about, and the vast majority of soldiers still in kitchens. Field kitchens became far more prominent and more advanced. Instead of just moving soldiers forward with a bunch of emergency rations as they had in World War I, they would put an actual kitchen together for someone to do cooking in the field, who would be supplied with the style of rations that could create larger meals for larger troops, for larger movements of troops. But much like in World War I, perhaps even more so, because by this point, a lot of warfare had become mechanized and mobilized. Frankly, soldiers spent more time, particularly paratroopers and forward soldiers, would often spend huge periods of time with only access to their emergency rations. Now, for those emergency rations, there were two main styles. The one that everybody wants, and the one that you're thinking of when you think of ration, is the K ration, or commando ration. These were given out to paratroopers and commandos who were going to be behind enemy lines, and they wanted to have access to full, decent meals. People pressed right up against Hitler's war machine. Let's give them a stomach full of something warm if we can. Everybody else was given these. Now that ugly thing, it's called a D ration. The instructions for the D ration were as follows. It's to be able to be stored for years, withstand massive shifts in temperature, contain enough nutrients for a soldier for a day, and taste slightly better than a boiled potato. These were rations that were made by Hershey. However, General Patton very specifically did not want his troops eating their emergency rations as a snack. They were for emergencies. To be fair, the types of troops that were supposed to get them, they were, in the event that you got cut off, never a plan. Whereas K rations were specifically, you're getting parachuted into enemy territory. We can't guarantee you when the next food supply or kitchen access will be. Here is your meals for months. And to be clear, starving soldiers in Bastogne would have rather had a D ration than dirt. That was kind of the point of the D ration. It was never supposed to be the thing you wanted or the thing that would replace your meals. It was straight up, here's how to not die. World War II wasn't the introduction of drugs to the field ration. Coffee and heavily caffeinated tea had been a frequent staple in military rations. You want your soldiers up and at 'em, you want them going. Hey, what do you know, that caffeine stuff is helpful. However, World War II was the place where a lot of that got solidified into practice. And in fact, arguably, it was, to date, any military's worst use of drugs on their field soldiers. I say worst like the Germans weren't doing, well, everything fucking evil that you can think of. But one of the things that the German army did was straight up feed their soldiers speed. No, really. The German army had capsules that were just straight up ketamine that would be given to soldiers. German methamphetamine, more like Schnelling salts. The Germans tried a little bit harder drugs. D9, for example, was developed in 1944 and was starting to be given out to some of the Air Corps in their rations. What is D9? Oh, it's just a minor little mix of a couple drugs, just a little bit of methamphetamine, a little bit of cocaine, and some oxycodone as a painkiller. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like that's the worst thing that the Germans did during the war, but imagine force-feeding soldiers methamphetamine, cocaine, and oxycodone, and thinking you're the good guys. Now, after World War II, we eventually realized it kind of didn't make sense to have both the D ration and the K ration. You're going to have food. And, well, let's face it, at that point, the military was already committing to a huge financial investment in figuring out how to make their soldiers get fed without having to rely on anyone else anymore. At that point, the military developed the MCI, Meal Combat Individual. Now, this wasn't quite a modern ration, but at bare minimum, it looks closer to a modern ration than any of the things that we've looked at before. The problem with the MCI was they were still trying to figure out long-term storage. And perhaps equally importantly, MCIs are not easy to move with. A lot of their storage tests were done with the cardboard on, and soldiers frequently had to take it off in order to stuff their pack together. MCIs were the main form of ration up until about Vietnam. And even during Vietnam, they were still, for most soldiers, weren't getting the food through the mess or through traditional means. You were eating an MCI, except for some of the special forces. The special forces were given a new space-age pack of materials called the Long Range Patrol Pack, or the LRP. Now, the LRP, from a delectability standpoint, left a fair amount to be desired. Everything was freeze-dried. And yes, that does actually mean you get a ton more range and a ton more life out of your foodstuffs. But the stuff that's freeze-dried don't necessarily taste the way that it was before it was freeze-dried. In a lot of cases, it creates a new, exciting food thing. Now, it's still far more delectable than something like a D ration, and it is far more portable than the MCI. So these were still something that a lot of the troops that engaged with them genuinely appreciated them. And if you look at the packaging of the LRP, you get pretty close to at least the feel of what MREs have. In the early 90s, the Cold Weather Meal, or CWM, was created. Now, these were designed specifically with two purposes. One, give soldiers without access to good ventilation, behind enemy lines, without access to good supply lines, a warm meal that is filling and nutritious. The use case for it ended up doubling up and having a legitimate humanitarian mission too. That cold weather meal that was developed eventually mutated, joining the LRP and combining together to create a package of meals that can be handed out. Meals that are ready to eat, or MREs. Now, I know some of you must be thinking, Finn, you obnoxiously beautiful creature, you. What the fuck are you talking about? I'm not in the military. I'm never going to be in the military. Why the fuck do I care what an MRE is or what the people in the military are eating? And this is where we have to get into something, because on the one hand, you're right that just because it works in the army or in with a certain unit doesn't necessarily mean it's going to apply to you. That's definitely true. It doesn't stop the fact that this is information that has, one, your tax dollars have straight up paid for it, and the focus of it is how to feed people who are on the move effectively. Now, the reasoning behind it might be, or it doesn't stop the fact that it's how to feed yourself when you're in a high calorie situation. Which brings us to the first requirement. See, nutritional requirements for this stuff are complicated. Now, nutritional requirements for food in general is its own complicated science that you can spend literal years getting master's degree in. The average human being has a caloric output of between 15 to 2,700 calories. Roughly, that's, it varies wildly from body to body. It varies wildly between, like, somebody who is larger is obviously going to require more calories. They have more bits that need energy. And the ranges are affected by a lot of different things, including hormonal makeup, including just genetic lottery stuff of how many calories you need and how many you burn. Add to that requirement, though, an additional 1,000 calories, because that calorie requirement is the assumption that you're just walking around your day, you're just doing shit. This is not a day. Going out, a bunch of kit strapped to you, hiking for a mile will feel like walking for 3 in some places. When you get wherever you're going to be doing strenuous shit. If you're camping, you're setting up a camp. If you're training, well, you're about to go out and do a bunch of hardcore training. That takes energy. If you're out doing, maneuvers or comm-def shit, you're out doing things that are intensive. These things take work and energy, and because of that, it's assumed you're going to need at least an extra 1,000 calories. MREs are traditionally heated, and there's a reason for that. When you eat something, your stomach has to break it down. I don't think it's particularly surprising that you don't just straight up use bits of hamburger to build yourself. It gets broken down into materials so that you can build you proper. Your stomach has to break the food down into the tiny bits that made it into what it was. Little proteins, little carbs, little enzymes, maybe a little iron here or there. Basically, it is generating the bits for you to build from the food, which is actually a chemical process. And fun thing about those, they cost energy. Now, from a physiological standpoint, this also leads to something interesting, because you break down parts, but that breakdown process requires a few things. It requires heat on its own, as well as energy in the form of the chemical transaction costs. Because of this, food that you eat that is pre-warmed is actually significantly easier for your body to process. Eating cold food, you have to expend additional energy warming your stomach up to do the breakdown process. Eating warmed food means you spend less of your energy turning the food into the bits that you can use and the energy components. So importantly, if you are setting up meals for yourself, it is really important, if you're going more than like a day, have at least one warm meal in there. It will make a world of difference to your energy levels. Note that specifically said more than a day. Next up, carbs, and importantly, complex carbs. A lot of the simple white flour and simple sugar, you'll burn it very quickly, which is actually a problem. It's better than no energy, don't get me wrong, but something that you're just gonna immediately use all of is why sometimes if you feel like you ate too much sugar and you have a crash after, that's why. You dumped all of the energy immediately, kind of got the body revved up for a big energy production burst, and then fed it no fuel. Complex carbs, like the stuff that you find in fruits, veggies, whole wheat, that kind of stuff. The good news about it is your stomach has to take a little bit of time processing it, and when they're processed, they create chains that essentially, from a chemical perspective, unravel slowly and give energy. That is usable energy for your day. And remember, your day is gonna be a long one. You're doing some hard shit. You're also gonna need a lot of protein. Every time you use your muscle, you're technically ripping it, and repairing it requires protein. Good sources of protein include lean meat, smoked fish, legumes, nuts, seeds. Then there's the question of healthy fats. Yes, you heard me right. Healthy fats. You'll find these in certain nuts, avocados, olive oil, a couple different things. I'm sure I'm missing one or two. Maybe on the screen right here. But you're going to need to be rebuilding with a lot of vitamins and minerals. And one of the things that people don't realize is pretty much all of your vitamins and minerals have a requirement for the use of healthy fat that they are soluble in as a delivery mechanism. So healthy fats are incredibly important when you're going to be straining yourself. You're going to be rebuilding shit, which means you need the ability to deliver things that you'll be rebuilding. Important for you to consider in your eating and dietary habits is your hydration. You need to stay hydrated. You need to make sure that you are drinking plenty of water. I mean, this shouldn't be that surprising. We are made of water. You are mostly water. You, sitting there right now, watching this video, the vast majority of the thing you are is H2O. Not to mention, anybody who has ever done anything strenuous knows what happens to the human body. Look, human bodies are gross, and I'm a little bit disgusted to have one. But that doesn't change the fact you're going to need to stay hydrated, because you're going to be using a lot of water during whatever physical activity you'll be doing. So make sure you are bringing plenty. I don't think this should be a surprise to anybody. You are mostly water. So making sure you bring enough water is definitely going to be a thing. How we bring the water is going to depend on how long you're going to be there. The best option, if you're going to be there for 48 hours, is probably just bring your own water. It's simple, especially if you're not going to be near a water source, especially if it's only going to be like a 24-hour thing. But if it's any longer than that, you might want to consider a water filtration system. This kind of thing, you can just find water near your campsite, and then you have infinite water, and also less weight to be carrying. And sweat isn't just water. So on the one hand, you are absolutely going to need to be replacing the water you are losing through sweat. You also need to worry about your electrolytes, because when you are sweating, you are inherently releasing a lot of the salt that you use for a lot of making your muscle connection work. Making sure you're replacing that with something like Gatorade or with rehydration salts is really important. Oh God, that view. Y'all, we have achieved this fantastic fucking view. The point of this video was partially to give you a bit of history and a bit of information, but also to announce, so we are going to have a series incoming where we go through a lot of different food options. We're going to try stuff that we DIY, stuff that we make ourselves, or stuff that we buy, and try out different bits so that you don't necessarily have to waste your money seeing if it works. That's gonna be it from me, y'all. Stay dangerous, keep each other safe, and remember, moral doesn't mean legal, and Stonewall was a fucking riot. Peace.